if it's no longer in the cards, we can't simply say that because Jews reject a democratic state, therefore we have to throw up our hands in despair, because we have to remember that South African whites rejected with all their heart and soul a democratic state as well. That doesn't mean you abandon the goal, because for the moment there's no constituency for it. If it's the only viable goal, and it seems to me that the democratic state is becoming the only viable goal, then that's the one that we have to aim at, and we can't simply avoid the issue because for the moment it's not realistic. Well, for the very longest time, a democratic state in South Africa wasn't realistic either. I'm not advocating one over the other. I'm simply saying that it may be the case that a two-state settlement is no longer a viable option. Anybody who's been to the West Bank knows that Israel has created so many facts on the ground that trying to separate out an Israel from Palestine is at this point, in my Africa, you couldn't separate out a black from a white homeland. Since you can't separate out the two, you have to figure out means of living with the two together.
Keith, you wanted to say something.
I think that the discussion we've heard raises some questions to political scientists. The first question is, why on earth should Muslim and Christian Palestinians be punished for the crimes of anti-Jewish racists in Germany, which have not even visited? I can understand that the German government should pay war reparations to survivors of the Holocaust or to Jewish communities, but why should Palestinian peasants have their land confiscated and Palestinian urbanites have their houses expropriated as a compensation for that? The speakers have stressed that the political Zionist movement post 1880 is connected with the rise of anti-Jewish racism in Europe, also anti-Arab racism in Europe. One could point on it in that noon there. And this is not a direction that is going to cause justice. The balance of power, or the imbalance of power, I think that the discussion we've heard raises some questions to political scientists. The first question is, why on earth should Muslim and Christian Palestinians be punished for the crimes of anti-Jewish racists in Germany, which have not even visited? I can understand that the German government should pay war reparations to survivors of the Holocaust or to Jewish communities, but why should Palestinian peasants have their land confiscated and Palestinian urbanites have their houses expropriated as a compensation for that? The speakers have stressed that the political Zionist movement post 1880 is connected with the rise of anti-Jewish racism in Europe, also anti-Arab racism in Europe. One could point on it in that noon there. And this is not a direction that is going to cause justice. The balance of power, or the imbalance of power, to help Palestinians or Israelis, or within Israel, Israelis who are Muslim or Christian in their belief, is going to depend upon the pressure, e.g. if Israel is backed by the USA, without concomitant countervailing pressures on the other side. Regina Sharif, a Palestinian scholar, has drawn attention to what she calls non-Jewish Zionism, the role played by evangelical Protestant Christian movements in the USA, numerically far bigger than Jewish Americans and far bigger voters, in giving immense support for one side against the other. And I think pressure both domestically and internationally to say dismantle those settlements and remove is a duty on those concerned with injustice. The last point I'll make here is Radio 786 listeners who are, say, UCT students or lecturers can do an interesting little research project. Go to UCT's Jagger Library and look up the first and the second edition of the Jewish Encyclopedia. The first one from 1916 will list that Zionism, political Zionism, was very different to traditional religious Zionism, that the Jewish clerical establishment strongly opposed the rise of the political Zionist movement of the 1880s, formed a black cabinet in opposition against it, that secular Jews also said it's a mirror of anti-Semitism, saying that Jews can never be like Methodists, Britain or whatever, but are some sort of separate ethnic group. At that stage, the Zionist movement was a fairly fringe group, though growing within the Jewish establishment. If you look at the same entry unto Zionism in subsequent editions of the Jewish Encyclopedia, you will notice that all the information about anti-Zionist rabbis and anti-Zionism in Judaism has been completely censored out. In other words, the Zionist movement has, with the rise of anti-Jewish racism in Europe between the two world wars, established hegemony over the Jewish community. And I think it's that dynamic, changing historical situation which one must look at. It's not connected with high antiquity. South Africans know how Afrikaner nationalism hijacked and perverted Calvinism to justify white racism in a way that Calvinists elsewhere did not agree with, and attempting to harness religion for nationalist or ethnic reasons has very grim consequences. Is it just a coincidence that, to my knowledge, the Israeli and the current German constitution are the only ones in the world to say anyone who ethnically is Jewish or German, as soon as they step a foot into that country, Israel or Germany, on the airport, is automatically a citizen of Israel or Germany, Volkdeutsch in German, and the right of return law in Israel. Clearly, both Zionism and German nationalism flow out of that 1880s, that pan-Germanistic, the Wagnerian epoch.
Okay, I just want to move on a little bit. I want to tackle the whole issue of present-day Israel, and I want to be very blunt about it. We've been talking, as Norman said, or Mark said, very theoretically. I want to know, in sort of clear language, is Israel racist? I mean, like South Africa was racist in its political philosophy. I mean, do Jews accept non-Jews as full citizens in Israel with equal rights under the same laws?
By the definitions in this discussion, it's a fairly easy question. Israel is racist, and Israel's policies as applied to the Palestinians, with pass laws, with land ownership restrictions, with restrictions on where they can live and where they can go, and different color license plates and different color passes depending upon which city they live in. And so by that definition, it's easy, and I suspect everybody on your panel is going to say yes. The problem is that definition is not the definition that's used by not just Israelis. It's not used by the largest country in the world, the United States. It's not used by most of the members of the United Nations. It's no longer even used by the PLO. Now, Norman is right. Just because a majority votes for something doesn't make it right. And just because something is happening at the moment doesn't mean we shouldn't oppose it. But nevertheless, it's terribly important not to sort of become insular and incestuous among ourselves and take sort of an easy way out and say, yes, Israel is racist and Israel should go, when in fact we are in not just a small minority, but so many institutions in the world, for whatever reason, have decided that Israel's desire to have a Jewish state is not defined by them as racist.
Would you like to say something, Ivan?
Yeah, shukran. I'd just like to comment. I think it's Mark who posed the question, what is the Islamic position on this particular issue? First and foremost, we've got to stress that the attitude of Islam to Judaism is governed by the first Islamic principle of Dinul Fitra, that is the natural religion of man, which places us firmly in support of Judaism. Secondly, Islam never doubts the revealed status of the Torah.
Sorry for interruption, I see Mr. Mohammed Al-Aziz off the line.
Oh, can you try and get him back, please?
Okay.
Thirdly, Islam recognizes that Allah has especially favored the Jews. But we understand this as a covenant fulfilled between the Jews and Allah. Their part is to serve Allah and do what is righteous. The emphasis on do what is righteous. Islam knows nothing of the so-called promise, that is the doctrine that Allah favors the Jews forever, regardless of whether they realize their part of the covenant. The second aspect is Zionism a solution or a curse? And just 5 basic points we'd like to highlight here. 1, the majority of Jews in the world, plus minus 14 million at this time, have not uprooted themselves to settle in Palestine. In fact, New York City has more Jews than Israel itself. Secondly, the nationality, or the national loyalty of Jews rather, is placed under suspicion. Judaism is seen as a religion, a policy, a race, an ethnic group, a land all in one, which is confusing the concepts itself. Thirdly, Israel, the so-called greatest achievement of Zionism, is in fact its greatest failure, because Zionism has not provided security for those 14 million or even for the 3 million within Israel at this point in time. Fourthly, secularism is deeply entrenched in the Zionist state. Zionism then substituted ethnic feeling for faith in God, and therefore it does not qualify on the basis of religious principles. Fifthly, Zionism in fact westernizes the Jew, because the aims of Zionism actually coincide with those of Western imperialism and colonialism. In actual fact, Israel has become the foreign policy tool of the so-called superpowers, and especially that of America.
Yeah, Keith, you seem to be writing something.
Well, I think that whatever the realities of the imbalance of power, if many countries in the world, from South Africa to the USA, to the European Union, to Japan, have had to face up to the challenge of racism in their society, and of racial laws, and of an ethnic injustice in the way budget and resources are allocated, Israel and other Middle East countries cannot imagine that they are exempt from the same challenges facing up to them. The people who complain correctly and loudly about discrimination against Jewish minorities under Arab governments in the Middle East are the same people who are silent about discrimination and the budget allocations against non-Jews in Israel. The Israeli law defines a Jew, the famous law of return, like the South African race classification laws of the bad old days. A Jew is any person whose mother is Jewish. Whether you believe in Judaism or an atheist is irrelevant, provided you haven't converted to another religion. This is a straight primacy of an ethnicism over any religion.
Mr. Mohammed Al-Aziz back on the line.
Thank you very much.
The Israeli law has in fact laid down a hierarchy as bizarre as the apartheid system of whites, honorary whites, coloreds and Indians, other coloreds, Bantus, and then foreign aliens of the Transkei, such as Mandela, Sisulu, and Mbeki. By Israeli law you have a hierarchy of Jews, of honorary Jews, that is those whose father is Jewish but whose mother is Muslim or Christian. Then you have non-Jews, that is those who are Muslim or Christian. Then you have residents, that is the citizens of Quds, Old Jerusalem, who are given a municipal but not a parliamentary franchise, although Israel has annexed forever, as it sees it, the old city of Quds, Jerusalem. And then you have what amount to enemy subjects who are totally rightless, that is the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And I think whenever one sees injustice, whichever country in the world that might be, Israel, Palestine, Egypt, South Africa, one has a duty to speak the truth, and one has a duty to go on talking about it.
Thank you. Imam Al-Asi, are you back?
Yes, I am.
Assalamu alaikum. I think you missed out. The question was, we were discussing present-day Israel and whether or not, in fact, it is racist, and I think we've got a fair amount of consensus here that it is racist. And I don't know if you want to comment on something. I know you've missed out, so if you feel that you want to give it a go, you're free to do so.
Well, I'll just be very briefly here. I'm sure all of us agree that it is racist in any definition of the word. The point that I want to make, though, I don't know if anyone touched on this. I'm sorry I got disconnected, not of my own fault. Something happened along the way. But anyways, the point that many times is really, at least as far as we living in the West, it's an ache and a pain, is that the Jewish community in the West, that the same community by and large that supports the racist policies of Israel, is the same community, ironically here, that is very vociferous, very vocal when it comes to opposing racism in the West. I'm sure that was the case in South Africa during the course of opposing apartheid. We saw it in the civil rights movement in the United States. We saw it even in the support that Jewish quarters in the United States gave to the anti-apartheid movement on an international level. It seems like racism is condemned all around the world, but racism stops at the borders of Israel. Israel cannot be racist to the Jewish communities, and here's where, by and large, I'm talking mainstream now. Mark and Norm, don't take offense to this. In the mainstream, and I've been to on campuses in the United States, spoken in front of audiences. Many of them have Jewish students in them, especially on the West Coast. And some of them would be frank enough to come and say, look, we have a problem. We won't discuss it in public. And that's why I say, and I don't think it's wrong-headed, Norm, when we go back and we say that, you really have to take a plunge into that, into the depth of what it takes to mobilize Jewish public opinion against the racist and iniquitous policies of the Israeli nation-state. I think it's a fair statement.
Norman, yeah, thank you.
Hypocrisy is as old as the beginning of time, I suppose. I'm currently doing some research comparing, for example, Nazi Germany and its treatment of the Jews with Americans and the treatment of blacks in the South. If you take Nazi Germany during the era 1933 to 39, the worst that could be said about them is what was the implementation of the Nuremberg laws, which prohibited mixed-race sexual relations, the anti-miscegenation laws, and also deprived Jews of the right to vote. Now that was standard in the American South for blacks until in the mid-1960s. The Supreme Court first struck down the anti-miscegenation laws in 1967, and blacks effectively only won the right to vote in 1965. So while all Americans were condemning Nazis for the Nuremberg laws, we were practicing it right here in the American South, not only up until the World War II, but till way after World War II. So the fact that Jews will be hypocritical and they're going to condemn racism everywhere except in their own backyard, well, I think that's as American as apple pie, or as Jewish as a blintz.
Okay,
it's just not unusual.
Yeah.
I don't think the answer is to probe the Jewish psyche.
Well, maybe for you, Norm, it's not, because you're familiar with it more than us who are outside of it. But I say, with a clear conscience, that being ignorant of what goes on within the internal, let's say, family arguments in the Jewish community, I don't know what you want to call them, there may well be a very healthy attitude that is in its formative stages to oppose this ugly thing called Israeli Zionism. It may very well be, but I don't know about it.
I don't think so at all. I think, currently, my own personal view is the current profile that American Jewry, organized Jewry, projects is repulsive. Not only on the Israel issue, but there's a kind of gross arrogance, gross indifference to the sufferings of others on the part of organized Jewry. I have no doubt about that, but I don't think it's a particularly Jewish issue. I think it's a function of power, it's a function of wealth, it's a function of class, and I think it's fairly typical of virtually any other group were in the position that Jews currently occupy. I don't think it's an issue of the Jewish psyche. I think it's an issue of, unfortunately, flaws in human nature which come out when you have accumulated a large amount of power and a large amount of wealth. And basically that's how I think Israelis are behaving. They're behaving like any ethnic group which has accumulated a large amount of power, backed by a large amount of wealth, and backed by the superpower in the world. They're doing what probably most ethnicities would do under the situation. I wouldn't call it anything particular to Jews.
Okay.
That's not my sense.
Okay. I'm just going to, we probably have approximately 10 minutes left, but there are two issues that I just want to touch on. And we're going to do a quick circuit among the panelists. The one is, I want to touch on the strength of the Israeli lobby in Washington, and also the silence of the establishment press on issues relating to Israel. And the second issue that I want to touch on is really where we're heading to for the future. What does the future hold for Israel? So can we start with the first one? It's the silence of the establishment press and also the strength of the lobby. Would you kick off, Mark?
At the current time, the power of the Israeli Jewish lobby in Washington, we're talking about political power to manipulate the American government and to manipulate other governments, journalists, intellectuals, the press. The power is immense. How long-lasting it is, how fragile it is, that's a whole other discussion. But the power is not immense only because of the wealth and influence and personalities that make up the Israeli Jewish lobby. Because in the last 15 to 20 years, the Arab regimes, the conservative client regimes, to use Noam Chomsky's phrase, have in a sense joined with the Israeli Jewish lobby. You've got the Saudi regime, the Egyptian regime, the Jordanian Hashemite regime. These regimes have in a sense gotten into bed with the Israeli Jewish lobby for two reasons. One, by playing ball with Israel, they get for themselves from the Americans things that they want. And number two, at a time of upheaval and tension in the Arab world and in the Muslim world, these regimes are scared of their own people and scared that unless they ally themselves with the power of the United States, which at the current time means the power of the United States and Israel, that their own regimes will be more likely overthrown than not. It's a very complicated mix. But it's interesting these days to go to social and political functions in Washington and to see that whereas we in the Jewish community are polarized, and when I worked with Philip Klutznick, who was one of the senior Jewish leaders in United States history, the Klutznick Museum is named after him at B'nai B'rith, and he's the only person who was president of B'nai B'rith and World Jewish Congress. And he told me privately one day the Jewish lobby, he was referring to AIPAC specifically, was the worst thing that ever happened to the American Jewish community. So at a time in history when there's great polarization among us Jews at social and political functions, nevertheless you go in and the people who are backslapping and shaking hands and on best terms are the people who run the Jewish lobby and the Jewish think tank that's associated with the Jewish lobby and the Arab ambassadors and the representative of the Arab League. It's quite a dichotomous situation here in Washington.
Norman, do you want to tackle the issue of establishment press?
I think those are difficult issues to generalize about because there's always the difficulty of trying to figure out the extent to which, say, the establishment press and, say, the media generally act as they do from a Jewish identity and the extent to which they act as they do because the United States, for its own interest, the U.S. government, the U.S. ruling elite